First in my list, UN Watch. Yes, you have the floor, sir.
May I congratulate you on assuming this important task, Mr. Chair, to address concrete measures to combat all manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and to implement the undertakings of the international community toward this end. We wish to comment on the various proposals and to offer several of our own. In undertaking such task, this committee must be guided by the principles of the United Nations Charter of 1945, which guarantees human dignity and the equal rights of men and women and the equal rights of all nations, large and small. Equally must our committee be bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which was enacted, as stated in its preamble, in wake of the contempt for human rights and the barbarous acts that outraged the conscience of mankind. Indeed, those barbarous acts, 6 million acts of murder, which formed the Nazi genocide against the Jews, were preceded by a propaganda campaign designed to promote hatred, to demonize and dehumanize the intended victims. With that in mind, Article 4 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination condemned such propaganda and prohibited states from inciting such racial hatred. Before us today are proposals from the Asian Group submission. We just heard Iran and Syria propose paragraphs 68 and 69, which accuse Israel of, and I quote, practices of racial discrimination against the Palestinians and other inhabitants of the Arab-occupied territories, end quote. Related provisions accuse Israel of, quote, racial practices against Palestinians, of committing, quote, a new kind of apartheid, a crime against humanity, a form of genocide, as well as aggression and acts of racism. All of this is in this Asian Group document. Now, on the one hand, the text before us appears as new, yet all of us here who are familiar with the events of the 2001 Durban conference will immediately recognize this text because they are a reproduction, virtually verbatim, of language that appeared in the outcome document of the February 2001 meeting in Tehran. These poisonous words were removed from the final Durban Declaration. They were removed under objection from numerous states. They were removed under the objections of high UN officials. They did, however, make their way and were inserted into the NGO text, and we recall that High Commissioner Mary Robinson refused to forward the language in that text, indeed refused to forward that text because of that language to the United Nations and to that conference. Last week we heard from High Commissioner of Human Rights, Navi Pillay, who referred to such language, and she said that this language was a betrayal of the principles of the anti-racism cause and the betrayal of the principles of the United Nations. Those of us who are familiar with this language will also recall it from the 1975 resolution seeking to equate Zionism with racism. Thankfully, this was repealed. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said that that resolution of 1975 was the low point in the history of the United Nations of anti-Semitism. To summarize, we urge that these proposals be removed. These proposals discredit the joint efforts to fight actual racism and pervert terms such as national self-determination and national honor. Meaning is stripped from racism when it is so broad as to include the Jewish National Liberation Movement. It makes a mockery of the struggle against racism. Second, it places the work of the United Nations in jeopardy. These actions do not go unnoticed by the world. At risk, Mr. Chairman, is the United Nations moral authority. The United Nations has lived because it had been thought that the nations of the world assembled together would give voice to the most decent and human instincts of mankind. This is now put at risk. Finally, the language of this text, of these provisions, are designed to promote hatred against the same group that these declarations of the United Nations were designed to eliminate. We know the states that were behind this language. We've been hearing it
points under this agenda, the chapter 5. So if you have contributions, please make it. And then I wish if you could conclude your statement by contributing your contribution to this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In conclusion, our contribution in our proposal is to eliminate these provisions. In place, we propose provisions that would condemn the incitement to racism that we have heard from Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, calling for Israel to be erased from the page of time in October 2005, since the Durban Declaration was adopted, saying, quote, "This stain of disgrace will be cleaned from the garment of the world of Islam, and this is attainable." Quote, "This we propose be removed in implementing the Durban Declaration's prohibition of incitement and anti-Semitism." Finally, the quote of the same President Ahmadinejad, and I quote, "In the Middle East, they have created a black and filthy microbe called the Zionist regime so they could use it to attack the peoples of the region," end quote. And finally, March 14, 2008, this year in Senegal, by the same President of Iran, quote, "The Zionist regime is on its way out," end quote. We urge that all of these provisions be condemned by the United Nations, and that the provisions proposed, be it in 68 and 69, or the other provisions that I've read out from this Asian document, be stricken from the text, and it's place that we support the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you for that, for your intervention. We